What made Ali's story so disturbing, and the point of the anecdote, was that he was also a secret collaborator of the American military forces in Iraq during their recent surge to bring about the end of the Civil War. He called in targets against the militiamen in his neighborhood for the American troops to raid and capture. Ali's blood vengeance, endorsed by and participated in by his mother, came out of old, deep-seated tribal traditions of honor that predate their religion, Islam, but which has become suffused with it too. The Americans who paid him had no understanding of Iraq's culture, and that was the terrifying truth. They were colluding with a serial killer in order to end war, and who knew what the effects of that would be? They didn't, and we still don't. Like a mutating gene, human history keeps moving on, accumulating its own DNA, which continues to show up in what we do and how we behave. Ali's story is extreme maybe, but it's not an isolated case. Revenge is a concept that to a greater or lesser degree is universal. Revenge is one of the keys to understanding war. Once killing starts, it becomes very difficult to stop. For every drop of blood that is shed demands another to avenge it. So when President Bush declared the war on terror after 9/11 and then invaded Iraq, it would seem that he unwittingly opened Pandora's box to further war, which continues unabated. Although troop withdrawals are now scheduled for Iraq, that country is still a seriously disturbed place. And in Afghanistan and neighboring Pakistan, it seems likely that a lot more fighting must take place before there is anything like peace or stability. However well these wars eventually end for the United States or its proxies, their legacies will be long-lasting. And again, Ali's story is just one example of the submerged parallel universe that the United States blundered into when it invaded Iraq and then bogged down in bewildered fighting. But it illustrates how the American government has often been ignorant of what some of their darker policies really mean, and therefore, ultimately, of their consequences too. There's an old Somali proverb that says, when elephants fight, the grass is trampled. The United States, as the most powerful country on earth, is like an elephant, and whatever it does sends shockwaves around the world. The effects of those shocks affect all of our lives. In today's globalized economy, it affects how you do business. Like it or not, it also affects what our families' futures look like. So if I can say two things with absolute certainty, it is first that there will be more wars, and in my lifetime, we have been at perpetual war for perpetual peace. And second, all wars leave wounds that take many, many years to heal. In fact, the healing usually takes much longer than the actual duration of the wars. But no matter where they are and no matter how long they last, someone has to be there to watch, to document, to analyze, to make everyone see and understand. And so I go to wars. Everyone in the world has an opinion about Americans, of course, and nowadays it is often negative. The election of President Obama has brought us a short respite on the negativity, but it seems to have been a brief bubble, alas. Sometimes the negativity is justifiable, but just as frequently it is based on false information or conspiracy theories that flourish, paradoxically, more now than ever in today's age of instant and constant global communication. How many times have I heard that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are wars waged by Jews and Christians against the Muslim world? This perception, widespread throughout the Middle East, is what has helped turn the conflict that began as a reprisal attack against terrorists into something like a clash of civilizations. One of the most common misperceptions I've encountered as a journalist is the perception that the US media was complicit with the Pentagon in preparing the pretext for the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and that nowadays no real news emerges from those countries because it is all somehow staged, managed propaganda orchestrated by the Pentagon working through its own pet reporters. To combat these perceptions, I've often turned the question back on my skeptical interrogators. I asked them, how did you learn about the American abuses against Iraqi prisoners in Abu Ghraib? How do you know about what happened in the prison in Guantanamo? To the blank looks I usually receive, I say, you learned about them from journalists, and most of the time from American journalists. Millions of people persist in believing that Osama bin Laden was a paid agent of the CIA before he turned against them, or that the Jews who worked in the Twin Towers had prior knowledge and evacuated the buildings before the 9/11 attacks, that it was not al-Qaeda but Mossad that provoked the US war against Islam, and so forth. But there is misinformation everywhere, some of it deliberate, some of it simply misguided. And sadly, in spite of globalized communications, many people continue to be isolated physically, economically, or culturally, or really don't seek any news that is contrary to their own enclosed worldview. That happens in all of our countries. We've learned at great cost, or perhaps are beginning to learn at great cost, that history is never past, that we cannot simply sweep it under the rug. The triumphalism that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union allowed the untreated wounds of the Cold War to fester through the 90s and ultimately brought about 9/11. The mission accomplished seen with President Bush on the deck of an American aircraft carrier was meant to be a triumphal end, but it was actually just a newer, more toxic beginning. My point is this: to tell the story of our times, a journalist has got to go to wars, or at least a journalist interested in the world has got to go to wars. It is unlikely that any side in a war is going to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, but without journalists there to document and observe as impartially as they possibly can, how are we going to know and understand what's really happening? Without journalists taking risks to be there, we compromise our ability to understand the world at all. When I say understanding, it is not simply a tale of boots on the ground, battles, or blood. We must comprehend how these wars shape perceptions and what effect those perceptions or misperceptions will have on our lives. At this time of economic crisis, when newspapers and magazines question their very existence due to changing consumer patterns and the rise of the free internet technology, journalists talk fretfully about the still elusive economic model that will sustain the media and provide journalists with a livelihood. Simon, Joel and Bob were talking about that at the beginning of the morning. Many wonder if what they do is still meaningful or is offering anything of value at all to the average citizen. And what I want to say is that if anyone wonders about the value of the role of the media, go to Russia today, where the government and its henchmen murder journalists at will for the sole reason of silencing them. In Mexico, in Guatemala and Honduras, journalists are regularly murdered, mostly by drug traffickers, hugely violent and powerful criminals at war with the state. Why do they murder journalists? Because journalists can report the truth, and in a war, the truth can hurt one's own side and aid that of the enemy. Facebook and Twitter, podcasts, webinars, and blogs are interesting new phenomena, but the disturbing trend is that more and more of these informational offerings are often PR, peddled as news. I've seen governments stand before a background that highlights the key words of the daily message. This tactic serves only to reinforce that what's going on is public relations too. We must not be crucified on the poverty of our own expectations. Journalists have to sail in these waters, and some don't navigate very well. We can say that what some journalists fail to do is tragic, but what so many journalists do is truly heroic. They choose what is right over what is easy. They daily risk personal political persecution, physical injury, and death in their efforts to expose corruption and champion the truth. Many journalists endure continual threats to their lives, and often the lives of their families too. Some are forced into exile outside of their home countries. Many feel helpless. Many in most of the world outside of the United States and Europe have never had that economic model to sustain their livelihoods that now worries so many of myself, my privileged colleagues in affluent countries like the United States, but they do it anyway. Journalists have to cope with greed, duplicity, and despair. Many of the revelations are never recognized, yet they have the determination to defend the least, the last, and the lost, and they insist on their right and responsibility to write the truth. And to end up, I want to say a word about a special kind of journalist too. Whether or not there is an economic model to sustain those of us from the affluent West who come and go from far-flung lands and conflicts, dropping in and out of foreign countries like visiting tourists, and I include myself here. It is the local journalists who must stay and brave the front lines at almost invariably the greatest sacrifice. They usually eke out the most humble of livings, and it's always been this way, and still somehow they manage to forge on with true, absolute courage, in spite of the contempt of their governments in some cases, and let's face it too, very often the apathy of their fellow citizens. At the best of times, such journalists are not only courageous, they are true heroes, rare individuals who actually believe that without their work, their society runs the risk of being informed only by the propaganda and coercions of the warring sides, whether it's a repressive regime they're dealing with or two sides in a civil war, or narco armies and the gunmen of corrupted security apparatuses. Last year I was in Somalia. The president of that tragic country and his government hold no more than a few blocks of the capital city, as radical insurgents daily bombard them, held back only by a few peacekeeping troops. But in the midst of it all, there are a few Somali reporters who daily risk their lives to cover what's going on. Often they're killed by suicide bombers or they get shot in an alleyway. They get threats for broadcasting music on the radio, but incredibly they persevere. Some years ago, I gave a workshop in Colombia to reporters from around the country who were reporting on their conflict. In a private session with one of my students, he said to me, "John Lee, it's all right for you. You're American. You work for a powerful magazine which has resources to send you everywhere, and you are protected by your visibility. But what about us here? How do we do it? How can we?" He explained that in his province, the violent paramilitary army was the real force on the ground, and that his own editors were secretly allied with them. He could not come out with the truth about what the paramilitaries were doing, massacres and so forth, or he would be killed. It reminded me of a dilemma I'd faced years before when I collected raw information in Central America and worked for a magazine that really wasn't interested in it. As in those days, when I met Melida, I felt a moral duty to get out the news. So sometimes I handed off the information I gained to human rights investigators. I hoped that it might save lives. I told this to my Colombian friend. He listened to me and nodded unhappily. He could do that, he said, but it meant that he was condemned to a life of stifling self-censorship. He was a writer, he said, so how could he write? I urged him to keep a diary. If he couldn't share his words with his public one day, he could exercise those demons in private, and hopefully, one day in the future, he could share his truth with the rest of the world without fear of reprisal. At the time, it was the only solution I could think of for him. 800 journalists, more than 800 journalists have died for their profession since Bob Simon was held in that cell in Iraq. Last year, over 70 were killed because of their work. The deaths of many have been ignored because it's very often the powers that be that kill them. Nobody's charged, nobody's convicted. In some countries, it seems it's not a crime to kill the messenger. The victims of this impunity are people like Anna Politkovskaya of Russia, who was assassinated a couple of years ago, shot in the back of her head outside her apartment door. She also, not long before, had come to New York to receive a prize. She was well known in the world. Hayatullah Khan of Pakistan was abducted and starved to death for investigating US Hellfire missiles used inside Pakistan. Armando Rodriguez of Mexico died for writing about drug traffickers, and Norberto Zongo of Burkina Faso was shot while investigating crimes in the president's family. We must honor them all, and so many others who fight daily for the truth and freedom to tell it. Without their courage, we are all well and truly lost. Thank you.